I walked back into the room with my spine straight and my pulse steady, though it felt as if I was stepping into a place where the air had changed shape. Every board member watched me, some with guilt, some with apology, some with the raw shock of people who had just realized how close they came to losing everything. At the far end of the table, Preston looked hollow. The color drained from his face. Madison sat rigid, her lips pressed together so tightly they had turned white. Harold gestured toward the seat at the head of the table. I sat, folding my hands in front of me, waiting. For a few breaths, no one spoke. It was Patricia who finally broke the silence. "We reviewed every document you provided," she said. Her voice was steady, but her eyes carried the weight of the past hour. "There is no question. Misconduct happened. Serious misconduct." A murmur of agreement echoed softly around the room. Patricia continued, "Effective immediately. The board is suspending both Mr. Pierce and Ms. Carter pending a full independent investigation." A sharp breath left Preston. He looked at Madison, but she stared at the table, her expression frozen. He whispered something to her, something desperate, but she did not respond. Harold added, "The investigation will include all financial transfers, unauthorized approvals, protocol violations, and external communications. If criminal activity is confirmed, this will be turned over to federal authorities." Madison suddenly pushed back from her chair, the legs screeching across the floor. "This is ridiculous. Evelyn set me up. She is trying to claw her way back into power." I stayed still. I did not need to defend myself. The evidence had already spoken. Patricia looked at her calmly. "We have documentation from multiple departments confirming the pattern of misconduct. This is not personal. This is accountability." Madison's jaw trembled. Her eyes darted around the room, looking for support, but found none. For a moment she looked smaller than I had ever seen her. Preston stood next. His voice was barely above a whisper. "Evelyn, I never meant for any of this to happen. I only wanted to position us competitively." "Then why hide it?" I asked quietly. He closed his eyes, and in that moment I knew he was not evil. He was simply weak. Weakness, unchecked, could be just as dangerous. The chairman cleared his throat. "Now, regarding the future of this company," he paused, letting the words settle. "We would like you to return as executive chairwoman in an active capacity, full authority reinstated, full oversight granted. We need you." For a moment, I could not speak. I had expected vindication. I had expected justice. But I had not expected to feel something rise in my chest that felt dangerously close to grief. Not for them. For the years I spent believing I had to let go of what James and I built. I lifted my chin. If I return, it will not be symbolic. I will restructure the oversight model. I will correct the weak points that allowed this to happen. And I will ensure our leadership reflects the integrity Heart Tech was built on. The chairman nodded. "That is exactly what we want." Patricia leaned forward. "And what this company desperately needs?" I took a slow breath. "Then you have my answer." A soft exhale of relief spread across the room. Even those who once doubted me seemed to sink into their seats, as if they finally trusted that the ground beneath them had stopped shifting. But there was one more thing I needed to do. I turned to Nancy, who sat quietly at the far end, her hands still trembling slightly. "Nancy, your courage to speak up today protected this company more than you realize. When I return, I want you on my executive review committee." She blinked at me, stunned. "Me? Yes, you have earned it." Her eyes filled with tears she quickly wiped away. The chairman stood. "Then it is unanimous. Welcome back. Mrs. Hart." The meeting adjourned. Papers shuffled, chairs scraped. Hushed conversations drifted through the room. Board members approached me one by one, offering apologies, gratitude, embarrassment. I accepted each with a small nod. I did not soften the edges of my words. I did not pretend this had been easy. Respect meant little if it was not rooted in truth. When the room finally emptied, I remained seated, letting the quiet wash over me. The sun outside had shifted west, and beams of afternoon light stretched across the conference table. Dust floated in the glow, moving slowly, gently, as if the whole room had exhaled. I looked toward the door where Madison and Preston had stood earlier. They were gone now. Their voices, their influence, their arrogance had been stripped away in a single morning. Karma was not always poetic or beautiful, but this time it had been swift and precise. After a long moment, I rose and walked to my old office. The room was dark. My hand hesitated before switching on the light. When the lamp glowed, I saw the empty desk. Someone had removed Madison's nameplate already. On the corner of the desk lay a small box with a note taped to the top. Property found during office cleaning. I opened it and felt a tightness gather in my throat. Inside was the brooch. Not the decorative one I wore today, but the one James had given me on our 10th anniversary, the one I thought had been lost years ago. I held it in my palm, the metal warm from the light. For a moment, the years folded in on themselves, and I could almost hear his laugh again, deep and soft, reminding me that what we built mattered because of how we built it. I placed the brooch against my heart and let out a breath that felt like release. I stepped out of the office and looked down the hall where employees moved with purpose again. Conversations felt lighter. The unease that had clouded this place for months had begun to lift. Change was already taking root. As I walked toward the exit, I spotted Emily waiting by the lobby windows with her father. She ran to me the moment she saw my face. "Grandma, did it go okay?" I knelt so we were eye level. "Yes, sweetheart. It went exactly as it needed to." Her father approached slowly. His voice was quiet. "Mom, I heard what happened. I am proud of you." Something inside me softened. "Thank you, Will." He smiled, small but real. I stood and took Emily's hand. For the first time in months, I felt something close to peace. Outside, the sky was opening into a clear late afternoon, golden and warm, the kind of sky that felt like a beginning. Before leaving the building, I turned back once more, letting my eyes linger on the glass facade of Heart Tech. My company, my legacy, my fight, my victory. If you stayed with me through this story, thank you. If you have ever been underestimated, dismissed, or silenced, I hope this reminded you of your own strength. Tell me where you are watching from. Share your thoughts, and subscribe if you want more stories of women who refuse to be pushed aside. The elevator hummed quietly as it descended to the basement level where the custodial lockers were kept. I held the uniform tight against my chest and breathed in slowly. Let them think they won. For now, when the doors opened, the hallway was dim and quiet. Tom waited a few steps away, hands in his pockets, watching me with a kind of gentle worry. "You don't have to explain anything, Mrs. Hart," he said softly. "Folks here know what kind of person you are." I nodded, grateful for his kindness. "Thank you, Tom." He hesitated, then added, "Madison's been trying to make this place hers. People are scared to push back." I looked down at the uniform in my hands, then I looked back at him. "Fear doesn't last forever, Tom." He studied me for a long moment, then gave a small smile. "I'll leave you to get settled." As he walked away, I reached for the locker assigned to me, the metal creaking as it opened. Inside was an empty shelf and a single hook. This wasn't the first time life tried to force me to my knees. It wouldn't be the last. But every time, without fail, I had stood back up, and this time would be no different. I hung the uniform inside the locker and closed the door with a quiet click. I stood there for a moment, letting the quiet settle in around me. The basement level always had a different feel to it, cooler and still, as if the air itself carried the weight of everything people pretended not to see upstairs. I took a slow breath and headed toward the custodial supply room. My shoes echoed lightly on the concrete floor, and with every step, I felt a strange blend of humiliation and calm. Tom was restocking a cart near the back wall. He glanced up when he heard me approach, and his expression softened in a way that made me feel seen without being pitied. There was something steady about him, something grounded. A man who had lived long enough to understand that life could turn on you without warning, but also long enough to know you can turn right back. "Morning," he said quietly. "Morning," I replied. He handed me a pair of gloves and a set of keys. I knew this building better than anyone, yet these keys felt heavier than the ones I had carried for years. He cleared his throat gently. "I put you on the 3rd floor to start," he said. "Restrooms and break areas. Nothing too heavy for your first day." I appreciated that he even considered what might be too heavy for a woman my age. Madison certainly had not. "Thank you, Tom." He studied my face for a moment, as if checking whether I was all right. I gave him a small nod, and he let it go. Some people know when not to press. I took the cart and headed to the service elevator again. As the doors closed, I caught my reflection for the second time that morning. The uniform hung awkwardly on me, like a costume I had been forced to wear in a play I never auditioned for. I lifted my chin anyway. When the doors opened onto the 3rd floor, the smell of coffee and floor wax drifted into the air. Early staff were settling in, chatting in hushed voices or flipping through emails. Some glanced at me and looked away quickly, unsure whether to greet me or pretend they had not seen me at all. It was fine. People act strange when they witness something unjust and do not know whose side they are supposed to be on. I pushed the cart into the first restroom, a small space with bright lights and spotless mirrors. Even so, I wiped the counters as if it mattered. There is a strange dignity in work that everyone needs but few acknowledge. I let the repetitive motions calm my mind. As I moved to the second stall, I heard voices drifting in from the hallway. I recognized them right away. Linda and Madison. I stopped moving, though my heart continued its slow, steady thud. "I don't understand why you insisted on this," Linda said. Her voice sounded strained. "It was necessary." Madison replied, "Evelyn needs to learn to respect the chain of command. She can't keep blocking progress. This is the only way to get through to her." There was a pause. Then Linda asked, "Did Daniel agree to this?" "Daniel understands what has to be done," Madison said with that smooth confidence she used when she needed others to believe her. "Anyway, we are close to rolling out new operational protocols." Evelyn would have slowed everything down. Linda did not respond, only the quiet shuffle of paper and the clicking of heels, growing softer as they walked away. I exhaled slowly, realizing I had been holding my breath. It was not just humiliation they were after. There was a plan behind this, something larger, something neither of them wanted spoken out loud in a hallway. I finished up the restroom and wheeled my cart toward the break room. The sunlight filtered through tall windows, catching dust particles in the air, and for one moment I let myself remember the early days of Heart Tech. The cramped warehouse James and I rented off Federal Boulevard, the nights we slept on office chairs, the sandwiches we shared because we could not afford anything else. Those memories warmed me, even as the present tried to pull me down. As I emptied the trash near the vending machines, 2 younger employees slipped in. They whispered, unaware or unconcerned that I was just a few feet away. "Did you hear about Evelyn?" One of them said. "Yeah, they put her in custodial. I mean, who does that to someone her age?" "Someone like Madison," the other muttered. "She has been on a power trip for months." They lowered their voices further, but I had already heard enough. The truth always finds its cracks. I wheeled the cart out before they noticed me standing there. The hallway felt colder now, not because of the job, but because the company I had poured my life into was no longer the place I thought it was, or maybe it was, and I was finally seeing it without the sentimental haze I had lived under for years. By noon, I had worked through 3 restrooms, 2 break rooms, several trash bins, and a hallway that someone had spilled coffee all over. My back ached, my knees stung, but my mind had never been sharper. Sometimes humiliation strips everything down until all you have left is clarity. I took the service elevator back to the basement to return the used linens. As I loaded them into the laundry chute, I heard footsteps behind me. Tom stepped closer. He held a small thermos in his hand. "I figured you might need this," he said. "Just coffee. Nothing fancy." I accepted it and felt a surprising rush of gratitude. "You doing all right?" he asked. I took a sip first. It was strong, maybe too strong, but it warmed me from the inside out. "I am fine," I said. He looked at me like he did not quite believe that, but respected that I had said it. He leaned against the laundry table and lowered his voice. "People upstairs are talking. They do not understand why Madison would go after you. You have always been fair, tough, but fair." I met his eyes. Sometimes fairness is exactly what threatens people. He nodded slowly as if he knew that truth well. I headed back toward my cart. As I reached for the handle, Tom spoke again. "One more thing. I saw something last night when I took the trash out to the loading dock. Madison was out there with a man I did not recognize. They were talking low. She handed him a folder. My heart paused for a beat. "What kind of folder?" I asked. I could not see the label, but she jumped when she noticed me, told me to mind my own business, and walked off with him. I thanked him quietly. It confirmed what I had already begun to suspect. Madison was not just consolidating power inside Heart Tech. She was reaching outside too. Tom gave me a nod and went back to work. I stood there for a few seconds, the concrete cool under my shoes, the echo of his words mixing with my own thoughts. I had been pushed down to the lowest rung of the ladder, but I was beginning to see everything from this vantage point. People think they are invisible when they walk past the janitors. They think no one notices the conversations they whisper after hours, or the folders they pass off in dim corners. But I saw and I remembered. When I returned to the 3rd floor later that afternoon, the hallways were busier. Voices filled the air. Keyboards clicked rapidly, and the scent of reheated lunch still lingered. I had nearly finished mopping the break room when I heard footsteps behind me. Linda stepped in quietly, her hands clasped, her expression drawn. "Evelyn," she said, "may I talk to you?" I set the mop aside and faced her. She hesitated. "I just want you to know I did not agree with how things were handled this morning. I was told to formalize the reassignment. I had no authority to stop it." I nodded. "I know, Linda." She sighed, relief and worry mixing in her voice. "There is pressure coming from multiple directions. Madison has been pushing changes through without proper review. Some of them could put us in legal trouble, and she keeps invoking Daniel's name to justify it." My stomach tightened. Linda lowered her voice more. "Please be careful. Something feels off. And whatever Madison is doing, she is not doing it alone." Before I could respond, she glanced toward the hallway and straightened up. Someone was approaching. She gave me a quick squeeze on the arm and slipped out. I watched her walk away, her shoulders tense, and I felt the weight of something shifting, something growing, something no longer content to hide in quiet corners of the building. I finished my shift in silence. When the service elevator opened back in the basement, the air felt colder than it had that morning. I hung the uniform inside my locker again, closed the door, and let the stillness settle around me. People who think they have won rarely look down. They never notice the ground shifting beneath their feet. But I noticed, and I knew this was only the beginning. The next morning I arrived before most of the building was awake. The parking lot was still gray with dawn light, the kind of quiet that feels almost respectful. I walked through the basement entrance where custodial staff usually came in, and for a moment I let myself absorb the strangeness of it all. The woman who used to have keys to every executive office now stood in a corridor that smelled faintly of bleach and old concrete. I changed into the uniform again, the fabric stiff from being washed too many times. When I shut the locker, the metallic sound echoed more loudly than I expected. Maybe I was listening differently now. I pushed my cart toward the service elevator, and as soon as the door slid open on the third floor, the buzz of morning energy hit me. Phones ringing, printers humming, people hurrying with coffee cups. A few looked at me, then quickly looked away. No one knew what to do with me anymore. That was fine. I had my own reasons for being exactly where they put me. I started with the restroom at the end of the hallway. As I emptied a trash bin, I heard footsteps and the familiar click of Madison's heels. Her voice carried that unearned brightness she used when she wanted to sound important. "Thanks for meeting early," she was saying. "We need these adjustments finalized before the quarter closes." Another voice answered, lower and uneasy. I recognized it as Nolan from purchasing. "I still think we need quality to review the revised supplier list," he said. "No, we do not," Madison replied sharply. "Too many people think their approval is necessary. It slows everything down. We move forward." Their footsteps passed the door and drifted away. I let the trash bag fall into my cart, quality approval being bypassed. That alone could shut down half our contracts. It had taken me years to build trust with auditors and clients, years of certifications, documentation, and careful negotiations. And she was dismantling it because she wanted to look efficient. I clenched the edge of the cart until my knuckles whitened. Anger, sharp and bitter, surged beneath my ribs, but it did not consume me. It clarified everything. The company was no longer simply drifting under poor leadership. It was being driven toward a cliff. After finishing the restroom, I headed to the copy room to empty the recycling bin. As soon as I stepped inside, the faint smell of toner and warm paper brought back memories. Daniel had done homework in this room when he was a boy. James used to hide candy in the bottom drawer of one of the cabinets to keep his energy up before long meetings. In this room, I had printed the first draft of our expansion plan. Now there was a stack of papers left behind on the copier. Employees leaving papers in this room was not unusual, but the top sheet caught my eye. It had Madison's name in the footer and a header that read, "Strategic Assessment Titanworks Cooperative Opportunities." My heart slowed, then hammered once, hard. I picked up the stack and flipped through it. Most pages were just summaries or blank templates. Then, near the middle, one page stopped me. It was a distribution plan for specific product lines we manufactured. The same lines Titanworks had been trying to replicate for years. The notations on the page were handwritten, and I recognized the cursive. It was Madison's. Next to one diagram, she had scribbled "Needs pricing margin breakdown from HeartTech. Will confirm with Preston." I did not breathe for several seconds. This was no longer speculation or rumor. This was proof of cooperation between her and Titanworks. Proof that she was coordinating something that would dismantle everything we built. She had left the papers here, likely assuming custodial staff would gather them without reading. A foolish assumption. People forget how much custodians see. I slid the page into the pocket of my uniform. The copier hummed softly as it went into sleep mode. When I returned to my cart, Linda stood in the doorway. She looked startled to see me, though she tried to hide it. Her hands were tight around a folder. "I was just looking for some forms," she said. Her voice carried a tremor. "Are you all right, Evelyn?" I held her gaze. Her eyes darted briefly toward the papers I had tucked away, but she did not ask. She was too smart to ask questions in an open room. "I am fine," I said, though we both knew the word meant something different now. "How are things upstairs?" Linda exhaled slowly. "Difficult. There is pressure for changes to be pushed through, faster than we can review them. Some departments are afraid to challenge anything Madison proposes. Afraid of losing their jobs, I said. Afraid of being targeted, she corrected. She stepped closer, lowering her voice. And it is not just workflow shifts. She has been requesting access to financial reports she should not need. And last night she asked me to file a role modification for Daniel. I asked why. She refused to explain. A cold shudder moved across my shoulders. Role modification often meant power consolidation. Linda clasped her folder more tightly. Please be careful. Something is happening, and I do not think you are meant to see any part of it. I nodded. I appreciate you telling me. She looked like she wanted to speak again, but stopped herself. She walked out, closing the door behind her. The quiet became heavier. I finished clearing the recycling and pushed the cart toward the break room. The hallway lights flickered slightly, and as I walked, I passed 2 employees speaking in low tones. She had an early meeting with that guy again. One whispered, the one from Texas. Preston, the other said. Yeah, I saw her get into his car near the loading dock. Why is she meeting with the CEO of a rival company? Makes no sense. Or maybe it makes perfect sense. The first replied, Have you noticed how many senior staff have left recently? Their voices faded as they turned into another corridor. I paused for a moment, steadying myself with one hand on the cart. I could feel the pattern forming now, each piece sliding into place. Madison wanted control. She wanted the company to look chaotic and poorly managed so that a takeover would seem like a rescue instead of a theft. I resumed my rounds. In the break room, someone had spilled cereal on the counter and left coffee grounds scattered on the floor. Normal messes, ordinary tasks. I wiped the counters and swept the floor, all the while letting my thoughts move through the puzzle Madison had created. As I bent to empty another trash bin, Tom appeared in the doorway. He leaned a shoulder against the frame, watching me quietly. You are working too fast, he said. Save some of it for tomorrow. His attempt at humor tugged a faint smile from me. He stepped further inside. I wanted to tell you something before shift change. I overheard Nolan arguing with someone this morning. He said something about vendor contracts being rewritten without proper review. That matches what I have been hearing, I said. Tom rubbed the back of his neck. Folks upstairs are on edge, and some of them are scared enough to talk. That is never a good sign. No, it is not. He hesitated again, then spoke in a quieter tone. Whatever is happening, you did not deserve to be put down here. I straightened and met his eyes. Thank you, Tom. We stood there for a moment in simple understanding. He left then, his footsteps fading down the hall. By the time I finished the entire floor, my body ached in places I had forgotten existed. I returned to the elevator, the cartwheels squeaking softly over the tile. As the doors closed, my reflection appeared again in the metal. A woman pushed into a corner she had never belonged in. A woman forced into a uniform meant to strip her of dignity, yet her eyes were more focused than they had been in years. When I reached the basement, I put the cart away and removed the uniform, folding it neatly in my locker. My fingers brushed the paper tucked into my pocket, the one with Madison's handwriting and the Titan Works notes. Evidence? The kind that could shake a boardroom. As I closed the locker door, the faint echo of metal rang through the basement. I stood still for a moment, letting the sound settle. Tomorrow would be different. I could feel it in my bones. This was the moment I stopped being the woman they pushed aside and became the woman who would push back. I drove home that evening with the paper still tucked safely in my purse, the steering wheel warm beneath my hands, my mind running faster than the traffic on I-25. The sun was dipping low behind the front range, throwing long shadows across the highway, the kind that make the world look older and quieter than it really is. By the time I pulled into my driveway, the weight in my chest had settled into something steady and certain. I was beginning to see the shape of what Madison was building, and I knew I needed to see the shape of what she wanted to destroy. The next morning I left early, but instead of heading straight to Hardtech, I drove to Daniel's neighborhood. His house sat in a quiet suburb outside Denver, the kind with rows of trimmed lawns and the faint hum of sprinklers turning on in the early hours. I parked in front and took a moment to prepare myself. I was not sure if I was here as his mother or as someone finally forced to confront the distance he had placed between us. I knocked, and it was Caroline who opened the door. Her small face lit up when she saw me, and she wrapped her arms around my waist before I could say a word. "Grandma," she said, "I missed you." I held her close. "I missed you too, sweetheart." She released me and glanced over her shoulder nervously, like she was unsure whether she was allowed to be happy that I was here. Before I could ask her anything, Daniel came into the hallway. His tie was loose, and his shirt looked as if it had been pulled on in a rush. He froze when he saw me. "Mom." His voice cracked just slightly. I nodded. "I hope it is not too early." No, come in." He stepped aside, and I walked into the house. It looked the same as always. Warm lighting, neatly arranged furniture, hints of Madison's immaculate taste in every corner. But the air felt tense, brittle, something unseen but heavy. Madison appeared from the kitchen, a mug in hand. She had that smile she used when she wanted to appear gracious, the one that never reached her eyes. Evelyn, what a surprise. I watched her closely. She had not expected me, and that alone told me more than anything she might say. I looked at Daniel. I wanted to see if he would stand close to me, or her. He stayed in the middle, unsure, pulling gently at his shirt cuff. "I came to see my granddaughter before work," I said, "but if this is a bad time, I can leave." Madison waved a hand. "No, of course not. Caroline was just getting ready for school. Go say goodbye while I talk to Daniel for a moment." She touched his arm, a small gesture, subtle but controlling. Daniel did not flinch, but he did not move either. Caroline slipped her hand into mine and tugged me toward the living room. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "Grandma, were you crying yesterday?" The question hit me deep in a place I thought I had learned to protect. I kneeled so I was eye level with her. "Why do you ask that?" "I heard Daddy talking last night," she said. "He said he wished he had spoken up for you. Did something bad happen?" I brushed a strand of hair behind her ear. "I am fine, sweetheart. Grown-ups make mistakes sometimes, that is all." She nodded, but did not look convinced. Then she glanced toward the hallway, lowered her voice even more, and whispered the words that tightened my heart like a fist. "Mom said you are making trouble at work, so she had to fix it. She said you do not know how to act anymore." For a moment I could not speak, not because the words hurt me, but because they hurt her. A child should never be caught in the crossfire of adult pride. I held her hands gently. "People say things when they feel afraid," I said softly. "None of that is your fault, and none of it changes how much I love you." She leaned in and hugged me again. Her small body trembled. I held her a little tighter. Then Daniel called from the hallway, "Caroline, grab your backpack. We have to go." She pulled away reluctantly and ran upstairs. I stood slowly, steadying myself. I walked back toward the kitchen where Daniel and Madison were talking in hushed voices. They stopped when they saw me. Daniel cleared his throat. "Mom, I know things have been complicated. Maybe taking a step back from the office is not such a bad idea." His words echoed the ones he had spoken to me in the meeting room the day he let me fall. But this time he looked genuinely torn, almost guilty. Madison placed a soothing hand on his arm. She said, "Daniel is right. Everyone wants what is best for the company, and for you. This is an opportunity for your mother to learn a healthier work dynamic." I stared at her. The confidence in her voice, the certainty that she was untouchable, felt almost surreal. She truly believed she had won, that she had broken something inside me that would keep me quiet. And then she did something that confirmed every suspicion I had. She leaned closer to Daniel, lowering her voice as if I were no longer in the room. "We need to move forward with the restructuring," she murmured. "Your mother will adjust. She always does. But we cannot let her block progress anymore." Daniel shifted uncomfortably. He looked at me then, and for the first time in a long time, I saw a flicker of doubt behind his eyes, a question, maybe even fear. I straightened my shoulders. I should head to work. Caroline needs you both right now. Madison smiled, that thin, tight smile she used when she believed she had closed a deal. "Drive safe, Evelyn." I opened the front door, but before I stepped outside, Caroline ran down the stairs, breathless. "Wait, Grandma." I turned and she threw her arms around me one last time. "I love you," she said. "Don't let anyone be mean to you today." I kissed the top of her head. "I will be all right, sweetheart." As I walked to my car, the morning air felt colder, but there was a steadiness inside me now, something unshakable. I sat behind the wheel and let the engine idle. Through the window, I could see the silhouette of Daniel and Madison standing in the doorway. She was talking quickly, gesturing with sharp little movements. While Daniel stared at the ground like a man trying to quiet a storm he did not know how to weather. I drove away slowly. The road ahead was lined with maple trees, their leaves beginning to turn, gold, rust, red, Colorado autumn, beautiful and brutal at the same time. My phone buzzed in my purse as I reached the main road, but I ignored it. I needed quiet. I needed space to think. Madison was not simply undermining me out of spite. She was positioning herself. She was eliminating anyone who could challenge her authority. She was isolating Daniel. She was manipulating HR. She was tampering with financial access and supplier contracts. And now, she was pulling my granddaughter into the shadows of her ambition. I tightened my grip on the steering wheel. There are lines a person should never cross, not in business, not in family. Madison had crossed all of them. By the time I arrived at Heart Tech and parked behind the loading dock, the day had brightened. Trucks were already backing into bays. Workers moving crates of components, forklift engines rumbling. Life moved on, as if nothing under the surface was shifting. But I knew better. Sometimes the biggest changes happen while everyone else is busy with routine. I walked toward the service entrance, the uniform folded over my arm. As I reached for the door, something caught my attention. Near the corner of the building, two people stood talking beside a black SUV. One was Madison. The other was not anyone from Heart Tech. He was taller than her, sharply dressed, with the kind of posture that suggested power. Preston. The same man Tom had seen her with. They were speaking low, but the tension in their stance was unmistakable. She handed him another folder. He accepted it with a slow nod. Madison glanced around the lot, making sure no one was watching, but she never looked down. She never saw me. I opened the service door quietly and stepped inside, letting it shut softly behind me. Whatever she was planning was moving faster than I expected, and if she was brazen enough to meet him here, in daylight, at our own facility, then she believed no one was looking closely. She was wrong. I hung my uniform on the hook in the custodial room and took a slow breath. Things were falling into place, and soon, everything would shift again. I stood for a moment in the doorway of the custodial room, letting the image of Madison and Preston settle into place in my mind. It felt like watching two people pose for a photograph they should never have taken, the kind that stays hidden until someone finally holds it up to the light. I tucked the thought away and changed into the uniform again, the fabric cool against my skin. The morning passed in a steady rhythm of small tasks, mopping, sweeping, emptying bins, wiping down counters. Each movement gave me time to think, to arrange the pieces of the puzzle I had been collecting. By mid-morning, the building was fully awake. Conversations drifted from cubicles. Printers clattered. Phones rang in sharp bursts. I moved through it quietly, unseen but observant. Just before lunch, I slipped down to the archives room on the first floor. Few people ever went there anymore. Most of the company files had been digitized, but the room still held decades of paper records, old contracts, original bylaws, amendments that had shaped the company slowly over time. The scent of old paper and conservation glue made something warm flicker in my chest. This room had held our beginnings. It held our mistakes and our triumphs. It held the truth. I closed the door behind me and locked it. Then I crossed to the far wall, where a familiar metal cabinet waited. I knelt down and took a key from my pocket. A small brass key worn smooth at the edges. I had kept it for years. No one had ever asked for it back. Inside the drawer lay a carved wooden box. Cedar. With a finish James and I had applied ourselves in our early years. I lifted it gently and placed it on the table. My fingers traced the initials on the lid. E.H. Not for Evelyn Hart, but for Evelyn and James Hart. We had carved it that way in 1982, when we still believed life had simple answers. Inside the box were documents I had not touched since 2014. The year everything changed, and I stepped back from the visible front lines of leadership. Back then, the board had asked me to remain as executive chairwoman, a role meant to provide oversight rather than daily involvement. I had agreed. I wanted Daniel to have room to build his own path. I wanted the company to feel less like a burden and more like a legacy. We also decided something else. The role would not be widely publicized. It would allow me to act quietly, to intervene only when necessary. I had believed it was the right choice. Madison's assent was proving how wrong I had been. I unfolded the main document, a formal declaration signed by the board, affirming my authority as executive chairwoman with rights that exceeded the standard, authority to review structural changes, authority to call emergency sessions, authority to override decisions that endangered the company, authority to remove senior management under certain conditions. No one outside that boardroom had ever been told the full extent of that power. I read the lines again, letting them steady me. I was not a janitor because I had been defeated. I was a janitor because I had been pushed into a corner, and from corners people often see angles no one else notices. I placed the document aside and pulled out another folder. Inside were letters from James, written long before his passing, business strategies, notes about future risks, advice for our son, and one short paragraph in his familiar handwriting. If the day ever comes when Heart Tech forgets who built it, stand up, not for pride, for the people who depend on us. I closed my eyes for a moment and let his words settle into the quiet space between my ribs. Footsteps echoed faintly in the hallway. I returned everything to the box, locked the cabinet, and left the room with a calm I had not felt in days. The building was quieter during lunch. Staff gathered in the cafeteria or slipped outside to enjoy the sun. I made my way to the loading dock under the pretense of emptying a trash bin. Tom was there, leaning against a railing while sipping water from a plastic bottle. He nodded at me. "You holding up?" he asked. I smiled faintly. "I have been through worse." He chuckled softly. "I figured as much. You got that look." "What look?" "The look people get when they are planning something." I let out a quiet breath. He was not wrong. As I tied off a trash bag, a large truck pulled up. I recognized the driver as Jerry, someone who had worked with us for years. He stepped down from the cabin and reached for a clipboard. Then he paused when he saw me. "Evelyn." He blinked as if unsure whether he should say more. "Hello, Jerry," I said calmly. "I heard things got shuffled around," he said carefully. "You could say that He hesitated, then lowered his voice. I have been delivering to this place for 15 years. Never seen a quarter as messy as this one. Folks inside look rattled. Something going on. Something always is, I answered. He gave a slow nod, then returned to his truck to unload crates. After he disappeared inside, Tom turned to me again. You know, he said, there is talk about a meeting last night. Some department heads were told new systems are being pushed through. No review, no explanation. It aligns with what I saw this morning, I said, and it aligns with what she wants. Tom frowned. Wanting change is one thing. Sneaking around with a competitor is another. I met his eyes exactly. He shifted his weight, clearly thinking hard. If you ever need someone to back you up, someone who has seen what she has been pulling down here, you let me know. I nodded. I will. I returned to the 3rd floor for the afternoon shift. As I approached the break room, I heard raised voices, not shouting, but sharp enough to cut through the usual hum. I stepped inside quietly. Madison stood near the refrigerator, a folder in her hand, while Nolan from purchasing stood opposite her looking frustrated. He said, if these supplier changes fail quality inspection, the entire production line could shut down. Madison replied, we do not need every decision filtered through quality. It slows down innovation. Nolan shook his head. This isn't innovation. It is reckless. Madison took a step closer. Her tone dropped into something cold. You are either aligned with the direction of this company or you are not. Which is it? Nolan stiffened, his jaw tightening. Then he walked out without another word. Madison turned, her expression still edged with irritation. When she saw me with the mop handle in my hand, her face shifted into something smug. I hope you are taking notes, she said. This is how leadership looks when people embrace change. I did not speak. I simply dipped the mop back into the bucket and continued cleaning. She lingered another moment, as if hoping to provoke some reaction. When none came, she walked away. As soon as she was gone, I released a breath I did not realize I was holding. Not from fear, from confirmation. She was cracking, pressuring people, losing control of the narrative she had worked so carefully to build. By late afternoon, most of the staff had filtered out of the building. The lights dimmed slightly, as they always did after 5. I returned to the basement and changed out of the uniform. The paper with her handwritten notes was still tucked in my pocket. I held it for a moment before placing it in my bag. When I walked out to the parking lot, the sky was turning orange with the last light of day. The air smelled faintly of pine. I paused by my car and looked back at the building, the company I built, the company James and I had poured our lives into, the place my son had grown up in. It looked solid from the outside, steady and respectable, but inside it was shifting, groaning under the strain of someone trying to twist it into her own design. I opened my car door and sat behind the wheel. A sense of resolve washed over me. The kind that arrives when fear has burned itself out and something stronger takes its place. Tomorrow, I would no longer simply react. Tomorrow, I would begin to fight back, and I knew exactly where I needed to start. I arrived the next morning just after sunrise, the air still cool enough to make me pull my jacket tighter. The parking lot was mostly empty. A few cars dotted the spaces closest to the building, the early risers, the ones who never seemed to miss a day. I took a moment before stepping inside, letting the quiet steady me. Today needed to be deliberate, quiet but deliberate. I signed in at the custodial desk and changed into the uniform again. The fabric felt familiar now, almost comfortable, though it still carried the faint chemical smell from the washing service. I tied my hair back and slipped the small evidence envelope into my back pocket. It held copies of the notes I had taken from Madison's office and a printed timeline of the suspicious meetings she and Preston had with the consultancy group. Not the originals, Those were locked away where no one could touch them but me. At 7:45 sharp, I left the custodial wing and took the elevator to the second floor. The doors opened to a quiet hallway lined with framed photos of Heart-Tech milestones. Groundbreaking in 1983. First product line launch. James shaking hands with our first major investor. I paused in front of that one for a second. His smile still warmed something in me. I kept walking until I reached the legal suite, a cluster of glass offices with frosted strips for privacy. Only one office had its lights on. Inside sat Harold Stein, our senior corporate attorney, 68 years old, white hair thinning a bit, but sharp as a fresh razor. He had served this company for over 3 decades. He had also served as one of the witnesses when the board formalized my role as executive chairwoman. Harold glanced up from his computer when I knocked lightly on the door frame. For a moment, he simply stared as if trying to place me, and then recognition shifted his expression. Evelyn. He stood up quickly and closed the door behind me. You should not be seen visiting this office in that uniform. I gave a thin smile. I agree, but here I am. He gestured to the chair across from him. Sit. Tell me what's going on, and tell me how much trouble we are actually in. I sat slowly. He looked thinner than I remembered, more worn. The stress of the past months had not spared him. I slid the envelope onto his desk. You need to see this. Harold opened it carefully. He studied each page, the crease between his eyebrows deepening. He tapped one sheet lightly. These are meeting notes. This handwriting is not yours. No, they are from Madison's desk. I found them yesterday morning. He lifted another page. And this timeline, where did this come from? From the procurement logs and visitor records, both accessible to any employee if they know where to look. He set the papers down and leaned back. Good God. So she really has been meeting with them. Preston, too. They have met 9 times since late August. That is not coincidence. That is coordination. Harold let out a long breath and rubbed his forehead. I suspected something was off. But this, if what I am seeing here is accurate, this is grounds for an internal investigation, possibly external. I looked at him. I need to know something else first. In the original bylaws, Section 4.3, subsection D, the authority granted to the sitting executive chairwoman. Does it still stand? He blinked twice, then 3 times. Evelyn, that clause has not been touched since 2014. To remove it, the board would have needed an 80% vote. That never happened. So yes, it stands. Meaning if I call for an emergency session, he finished the sentence, they must convene within 48 hours. Meaning if I request a full audit of executive decisions, he nodded again, they must comply. And if I determine a senior officer has knowingly endangered this company, he swallowed, you may suspend them pending investigation. The room fell quiet. The hum of the old fluorescent lights above us filled the space where my heartbeat should have belonged. He finally spoke. Evelyn, are you planning to use this? I met his eyes. Harold, they forced my hand. I am not doing this for pride. I am doing this because this company is tipping toward a cliff and no one wants to admit it. He nodded, slow and grave. Then you will need more than this envelope. You will need documentation, witnesses, a clear timeline, and the board's formal recognition. You will also need to be prepared for retaliation. Madison and Preston are not amateurs. They have positioned themselves carefully. I exhaled. I know. He studied me for a moment. You look tired, but not defeated. I smiled faintly. I stopped being defeated years ago. He pushed a stack of blank forms toward me. Start writing. We need to build the foundation before you move. And Evelyn, yes, be cautious. Once this begins, you cannot take it back. I left his office an hour later, my mind sharp and steady. The coffee machine in the hallway sputtered as I refilled a paper cup. A few employees passed by, offering polite nods. None of them looked twice at the uniform. I took the elevator back to the basement and changed into my regular clothes. Simple slacks, a soft blazer, shoes that carried more history than shine. Standing in front of the mirror, I folded the uniform neatly and placed it in the locker. I would need it again soon enough. But not today. Today I needed to be seen. When I walked through the reception area, the front desk attendant blinked hard. Her name was Lila, mid-20s, sweet-natured, always a little nervous around senior staff. She hesitated. "Miss Hart, I thought you were," she trailed off. I offered a calm smile, working, as always. She nodded quickly and went back to her computer. Trying not to stare, I entered the West Wing, where the executive offices sat behind a glass partition. A tension hung in the air. Employees whispered in small clusters. 2 department heads stood near the corner, their faces tight with worry. I stopped near them, something happening. The older of the 2, Mark Shelby, lowered his voice. "It is everything. Sudden procedural changes. Supplier approvals pushed through without review. And this morning, Preston supposedly instructed finance to reroute project funds without consulting the CFO. People are spooked." My jaw tightened. "Thank you for telling me." I continued down the hall. Each step felt like peeling away the last remnants of the disguise I had worn. Not the uniform, but the silence, the waiting, the pretending. When I reached my old office door, now labeled with Madison's name, a familiar ache pulled in my chest, not heartbreak. Something sharper, something that had waited too long. I stood there for a full breath before turning away. My destination was the glass conference room at the center of the executive wing. Most mornings it sat empty until 9. Not today. Today the blinds were partially drawn, and shadows moved behind them. Inside, I saw Preston leaning over the table, speaking in a low voice. Madison stood beside him, arms crossed, expression tight. A man in a sport coat I did not recognize sat at the head of the table, flipping through a binder. The binder bore the logo of the consulting group. Another unapproved meeting. My pulse steadied. My hands relaxed. The pieces were aligning faster than I expected. Then Madison turned slightly, and through the half-closed blinds her eyes met mine. She went still. Her expression flickered from irritation to disbelief to something colder. I held her gaze. She straightened her posture, smoothed her jacket, and made her way toward the door. I heard her heels before the door swung open. She stepped out into the hall, shutting the door behind her. The smile she gave me was thin and predatory. "You should not be up here, Evelyn." I lifted my chin. "And you should not be holding off record strategy meetings without board approval." Her smile faltered, just for a second. Then she recovered. "You really do not know when to step aside. And you really do not know who you are dealing with." The air between us changed, turning still and sharp like winter air before a storm. She leaned in just slightly. "Whatever game you think you are playing, you will lose. People like you always do." I met her eyes without blinking. "People like me built this place long before you ever walked through the door." Her cheek twitched. Then the conference door opened again, and the man in the sport coat stepped out holding his binder. He glanced between us with a confused frown. "Is everything all right?" Madison stepped back quickly. "Fine. We are fine." I did not move. He nodded uncertainly and walked down the hall. Madison lowered her voice again. "You should really go back to whatever closet they have you cleaning." I let a small breath escape. "I think I will stay." Her face drained of color, just slightly, just enough. This was the moment I knew. Tomorrow I would call the board. Tomorrow everything would shift. But for now, I let the silence hold while her confidence cracked at the edges, barely visible but undeniable, and I turned and walked away, leaving her standing alone in the hallway that used to be mine. I walked back to my car without looking over my shoulder, but the echo of Madison's shaken breath followed me all the way to the parking lot. I did not let myself savor it. Not yet. Pride was a dangerous thing in moments like this. So was relief. I needed a clear head for what came next. The air outside had warmed since morning, carrying the faint hum of traffic and the smell of roasted coffee from the cafe across the street. I unlocked my car, slid behind the wheel, and sat there for a moment with my hands resting lightly on the steering wheel. My pulse was steady. My mind sharpened into focus like a lens clicking into place. It was time to stop gathering pieces and start arranging them. I drove home. A small 2-story house in a quiet Maple Grove neighborhood where the lawns were trimmed and neighbors waved whether you knew their names or not. When I stepped inside, the familiar scent of lavender cleaner and old wood grounded me. The house looked the same as always, but I felt different. I went straight to my study. The afternoon sun hit the bookshelf just right, warming the spines of old binders and manuals I had written long before anyone knew my name in the industry. I sat at my desk and opened my laptop. A stack of printed documents waited beside it. Harold's voice echoed in my mind. You will need a full timeline, witnesses, documentation. I began typing. Every detail, every meeting I had uncovered, every policy violation, every budget inconsistency. The document grew line by line, an expanding blueprint of misconduct. I cross-checked my notes, cross-referenced dates, and attached copies of the procurement logs and visitor entries. Hours passed. The light in the room shifted from gold to blue to the soft gray of early evening. My back ached and my fingers cramped, but I kept going. This had to be airtight. It had to withstand scrutiny from a board that had not seen me exercise real authority in years. Around 7, my phone rang. I nearly ignored it, assuming it was a telemarketer or a political survey. But then I saw the name. Charlotte Lane. I hesitated, then answered. She did not even say hello. I heard you were in the building today. Her voice carried something tense beneath the surface. I paused. And how did you hear that? Half the department saw you walk into the executive wing. People are talking. About what exactly? About everything. People are scared. Evelyn. I closed my eyes for a moment. Charlotte had worked in operations for almost 2 decades. She was steady, loyal, and more perceptive than most managers ever realized. Scared of what? I asked quietly. Scared of losing their jobs. Scared the company is drifting into something unsafe. Scared because no one knows who is running what anymore. You know how it looks from the outside. A dozen decisions made without transparency. A handful of suppliers no one recognizes. Rumors that our budgets have been rerouted. Then you show up again, in the building, and in uniform. I exhaled slowly. I know what it looks like. That is why I am doing something about it. A silence followed. You really are taking this on again. I am. But Charlotte, I need you to tell me what you have seen. Off the record. Another silence, then a small sigh. All right, but just for today, I am not risking my job over gossip. This is not gossip. She hesitated again, then spoke. 3 weeks ago, procurement got an urgent approval request from Preston. A new supplier for specialized sensors. No one knew who they were. No certifications, no history, nothing. But the approval was pushed through in 10 minutes. And last week, 2 supervisors said Madison bypassed the testing protocol on a prototype, just waved it through. They said she told them the process was outdated. My stomach tightened. Anything else? Charlotte lowered her voice. People are saying one of the consultants has been in and out of the building at odd hours, not logged. Someone from your side of the building should have caught it. I closed my eyes again. The missing name from the visitor logs, the gaps in the timestamps. It made sense now. Thank you. I said, you did the right thing telling me. I'm not sure I did. Her voice softened. Just be careful. They are not playing small. When she hung up, the silence in the room felt heavier. I looked at everything spread across my desk. The papers, the laptop, the notes written in my own handwriting. And then my gaze landed on the framed photo of James. His smile was bright, his arm wrapped around my shoulder. Our faces flushed from laughter. I touched the edge of the frame lightly. I had not let myself think of him too much in the past weeks, but tonight his presence felt close. You always said never to fight a battle you do not understand, I whispered. Well, I understood this one now. I went back to the laptop and opened a new document. At the top, I typed, Emergency Board Session Request. Then I wrote, by the authority granted to me as Executive Chairwoman under the Heart Tech Bylaws Section 4.3, Subsection D, I hereby request an emergency session of the Board of Directors within 48 hours. Purpose, presentation of evidence regarding executive misconduct, policy violations, fiscal irregularities, and potential external influence compromising corporate integrity. I read it twice. It was clean, precise, legally binding. A soft knock suddenly sounded at the front door. I froze. No one visited me unannounced. I stood carefully and moved through the hallway, my heartbeat tapping faintly in my ears. I opened the door just a few inches. A teenager stood on my porch, curly hair, backpack, wide, anxious eyes. My granddaughter, Emily. My breath softened instantly. Emily, honey, what are you doing here? She looked down at her shoes, shifting her weight. Dad dropped me off. He said he needed to cool off. My chest tightened. Come inside. Tell me what happened. She stepped in and I closed the door. She sat at the small bench near the entryway. I crouched in front of her. Talk to me. She swallowed hard. Mom and Dad were fighting again. About work. About you. Mom said you were stirring up trouble. Dad said she did not know what she was talking about. Her eyes lifted to mine. Grandma, are you in trouble? The question hit me harder than anything Madison had said. I sat beside her and wrapped an arm around her shoulders. No, sweetheart. I am not in trouble. I am fixing a problem that should have been fixed a long time ago. She leaned into me, a small tremor in her breathing. Dad said you were the only one who ever kept the company safe. Mom said that is the problem. I went still. Your mother said that. Emily nodded. She gathered herself. Grandma, is our family going to be okay? For a moment I could not speak. I held her a little tighter. We will be, I said finally, but things might get messy before they get better. She nodded, trusting me in the way only children can. I kissed her forehead and led her upstairs to the guest room. Once she was settled, I went back to my study. The house felt different now, not calm, not quiet, like a storm brewing in the walls. I printed 3 copies of the emergency request. I placed each in a sealed envelope. Then I wrote the name of every board member in firm, steady handwriting. When I was done, I laid the stack in the center of the desk. Tomorrow morning they would be hand-delivered. And tomorrow night, everything in this company would begin to shift. I woke before dawn, the house still dark and silent except for the soft hum of the refrigerator downstairs. For a moment I lay still, the weight of the day pulsing in my chest. Then I rose quietly, careful not to wake Emily, and went to the kitchen to put on coffee. The smell filled the room, warm and grounding, something familiar in a morning that felt anything but. By 6:30, the stack of envelopes sat on my dining table, aligned in a neat row. I checked them one last time, though I already knew every letter inside by heart. The names on each envelope were written cleanly, without hesitation. My handwriting looked steadier than I felt. At 7:05, I drove to the first house on my list. It belonged to Richard McKinnon, one of the senior board members, a man who wore self-importance like cologne. His driveway was empty except for a sedan parked at an angle, as if he had come home late and too tired to straighten it. I left the envelope on his porch, tucked slightly beneath the welcome mat so the wind would not take it. The second house belonged to Patricia Barrett. She was sharp, perceptive, and not as easily manipulated as others. I placed her envelope in her mailbox, knowing she checked it first thing every morning. House by house, name by name. The weight inside me loosened. By 8:15, the last envelope had been delivered. I sat in my car for a moment, the engine idling, letting the reality settle. There was no going back now. When I returned home, I found Emily sitting at the kitchen counter, swinging her legs and eating cereal. Her curls were a soft halo in the morning light. She looked up when I came in. "Grandma, are you going to work today?" I brushed her cheek with my hand. "Not today, sweetheart. Today, Grandma has things she has to take care of." Dad texted me. She said he asked if you were okay. I paused. "And what did you tell him?" "I told him you were fine and strong." Her small grin pushed something warm into my chest. I smiled back, kissed her forehead, and walked her to the door when her father finally arrived to pick her up. He looked tired, his face drawn, but he avoided my eyes. That told me enough. After she left, I showered and dressed carefully. Dark trousers, a soft blue blouse, blazer pressed. I pinned a small silver brooch to my lapel. Not a family heirloom, just something James had once complimented. I had not worn it in years. At 10:15, my phone buzzed, a message from Harold. "They received the notices. Expect movement today." I typed a simple reply, "Understood." Minutes later, another message came through. "Be prepared. Some of them are not taking this well." I slipped the phone into my purse. I had expected resistance, panic even, but whatever came, I was ready. Around 11, as I sat in my study reviewing the audit notes again, my doorbell rang. I stiffened. No one was scheduled to visit. I opened the door slowly. It was Nancy Hollis, the company's chief financial officer. She stood with her purse pulled tight against her body, her expression strained. "Nancy," I stepped back to let her in. "What brings you here?" She walked inside, her steps clipped, her shoulders tense. When she turned to me, her voice wavered. "You should know they are meeting already. An informal gathering. Not all of them, but enough to cause concern." My pulse steadied. "What are they saying?" She exhaled shakily. "They are divided. Some support the session you requested. Others are claiming you are overstepping, and the rest are afraid, terrified of a scandal, terrified of what it might mean for the company." I nodded slowly. "Of course they are." She suddenly grabbed my hand. Her grip was cold. "Evelyn, I need to tell you something before this gets any further. Last month, Preston instructed finance to process a transfer that bypassed audit approval. I questioned it. He shut me down. I pushed back. And Madison showed up in my office 15 minutes later, smiling, telling me to stop making trouble. The funds went through anyway. My breath caught. "Did you document any of it?" She nodded. "Yes, I kept copies. Off system. If you need them, they are yours." Relief mingled with anger in my chest. "Nancy, you know what this means." She swallowed hard. "That I am probably about to lose my job." I held her gaze. "You will not lose your job. Not if I have anything to say about it." Her eyes filled with tears she refused to spill. "Good, because I cannot stay quiet anymore." We talked through the details of the transfers, the inconsistencies she had found, the sudden budget gaps no one had been able to explain. By the time she left, I had what I needed to complete the file. It felt like a battle plan growing larger, sharper, more undeniable. At 1:20, my phone rang again. It was a number I did not recognize. I answered cautiously. A clipped male voice spoke. "Mrs. Hart, this is Detective Langley with the Maple Grove Police Department. We received a report that someone at your address may be involved in ongoing corporate misconduct. We were asked to follow up." For a long moment I said nothing. My spine straightened, and the room felt colder. "And who filed this report?" It came through our online system, anonymous. Of course it did. I inhaled slowly. Detective, you are welcome to come by. But be aware I am filing my own allegations with the Federal Corporate Crimes Division later this week. There was a pause. Then his tone shifted from procedural to cautious respect. Understood, ma'am. I will stop by tomorrow. I ended the call and set the phone down gently. My hands did not shake. They were already trying to smear me. They were trying to build a wall of suspicion around me before the board could even hear my evidence. I looked out the window toward the quiet street. The maple trees swayed lightly in the breeze. A jogger passed by with a dog pulling at the leash. The scene felt too peaceful for the storm gathering inside this company. But storms could be redirected. They could be controlled. They could be survived. I sat back at my desk and began assembling the final packet of evidence. Tabs, labels, chronological order. Nothing messy, nothing ambiguous. By 4:30, the file was complete, thick enough to crush any argument they might try to raise. I closed the binder, ran my hand across the cover, and felt a strange calm settle into my bones. Then the phone rang again. This time it was a number I knew. Patricia Barrett, I answered. Her voice came low and urgent. Evelyn, something is happening. A group of board members just gathered in the executive conference room. 2 of them asked for your personnel file. That has never happened before. They are preparing for a fight. I closed my eyes for a moment. Thank you for telling me. She hesitated. Do you need anything from me before the session tomorrow? Just one thing. Do not let them rewrite the truth. Not this time. I could hear her steady herself. I will not. And some of us still remember who actually built this place. When she hung up, the room fell silent again. But it was a different silence now. Heavy, waiting. I looked at the clock on the wall. 5:40. The sun was beginning to set, painting the room in amber light. Tomorrow the board would gather. Tomorrow they would hear everything. And tomorrow, whether they wanted to or not, they would learn exactly who they had underestimated. The morning of the board session arrived with a sky so still and pale it looked washed clean. I barely slept. I lay awake most of the night listening to the house settle, the faint creak of wood, the rustle of leaves brushing against the bedroom window. Every sound reminded me that once I stepped into that boardroom, there would be no returning to the quiet life I had tried to build after stepping down. Today would reshape everything. I dressed slowly, choosing a charcoal suit that fit me like memory. I pinned the small silver brooch to my lapel, the same one I had worn when James and I signed our first large manufacturing contract. It was the closest thing I had to armor. At 8:30, I left my house, the binder of evidence resting in the passenger seat like a second heartbeat. Traffic was light. The short drive to Hearttech surprisingly quiet. My breath steadied as the building came into view. The sun caught the glass exterior, throwing sharp light across the parking lot. Employees streamed inside, their expressions tense, whispers carrying in the cool air. They knew something was coming. I walked through the front doors, ignoring the startled looks from a pair of supervisors near the elevators. I had no intention of hiding today. As I stepped into the executive wing, the air thickened. Voices murmured behind closed office doors. Attention buzzed like static. I kept walking until I reached the main conference room. The frosted glass was opaque, but I could see the silhouettes inside. The door was closed. A small wooden sign hung on the handle. Private session in progress. Before I knocked, I felt a presence behind me. I turned. It was Patricia. Her face looked drawn but determined. They started early, she whispered. Some of them are rattled. Preston tried to convince them to postpone the vote, and Madison is angry, very angry. I nodded once, then let them be angry. Patricia leaned in slightly, and Evelyn, do not hold back. Some of us have been waiting for someone to finally do the right thing. She stepped past me and entered the room ahead of me. I waited for my cue. A moment later, the door cracked open. Harold stood there, his expression unreadable. "It is time. Come in." I pushed the door fully open and walked inside. Every seat around the table was filled. 12 board members, some stiff-backed, some avoiding my eyes, some watching me with sharp curiosity. At the far end of the table sat Preston and Madison. They looked like they had aged 10 years overnight. Preston's tie was crooked, and Madison kept smoothing her sleeve as if she could iron away the panic underneath. I settled into the empty chair at the head of the table, a place that had once belonged to me. Silence fell. Harold cleared his throat. "This emergency session has been convened under the authority of Section 4.3, subsection D. Mrs. Hart has requested the opportunity to present findings relevant to potential executive misconduct." I opened the binder. The pages felt cool beneath my fingers. "Thank you." I looked at each person in the room. The past year has placed this company in danger, and the danger has not come from our competitors or the market. It has come from within. A few murmurs rippled across the table. I continued, "What you're about to see are documents, financial records, and procedural evidence detailing decisions made without authorization. Decisions that have jeopardized contracts, redirected funds, compromised testing protocols, and created vulnerabilities that could dismantle the legacy we all claim to protect." I slid the first set of documents across the table. Patricia reached for them first. Others leaned in. Madison stiffened, her jaw tightening. "These are procurement logs showing approvals forced through by Mr. Pierce without required oversight." More papers. "These are visitor records showing repeated unlogged meetings between senior staff and an external consulting group that stands to benefit directly from Hearttech's decline." Another ripple, louder this time. I turned to Nancy, who sat near the middle of the table, her hands folded tightly. "Nancy, would you please explain the financial inconsistencies you discovered?" She swallowed but lifted her chin. "Over the past 2 months, certain transfers were rerouted to accounts not connected to any approved projects. When I attempted to verify the purpose, I was dismissed. These transfers bypassed audit, violated protocol, and were flagged by 2 outside firms." Someone at the table swore under their breath. I moved on. "Here is evidence of testing protocols bypassed in October. Engineers were instructed to clear incomplete results without review. These directives came from Miss Carter." Madison sat forward sharply. "That is a lie. Those tests were outdated." I looked at her calmly. "Outdated or not, they were federally required, and bypassing them is not modernization. It is fraud." Her face flushed. "You have no idea what you're talking about." I ignored her and continued. "This final section contains documentation linking internal decisions to negotiations with an external firm that has quietly acquired 2 of our smaller competitors in the last year. If you look at the timestamps, the alignment is impossible to dismiss." A stunned quiet fell across the room. No one moved. I closed the binder gently. "I will now step out to allow the board to deliberate. But before I do, I need to say something as clearly as possible." I looked directly at Madison, then Preston, then let my gaze sweep the table. I did not return to reclaim a title. I returned to protect this company. The one I built with my husband from an empty warehouse floor. The one you swore to protect alongside me. Whatever happens in this room today, let it be guided by truth and not fear. I stood. I picked up the binder. Then I walked out, leaving the door to close behind me. The hall was quiet. I exhaled, a long breath that felt like it came from years ago. My legs felt heavy as I walked to the far window, where sunlight spilled across the carpet. I braced my hand on the glass. From inside the room, voices rose, some angry, some scared, some firm. I caught fragments through the glass wall, words like illegal, breach, audit, jeopardy. After 20 minutes, the voices grew louder. Someone shouted. A chair scraped across the floor. Then silence again. I paced the length of the hallway. My breaths came steady. It was no longer in my hands now, and yet every moment felt weighted, suspended in that thin space between collapse and correction. The door finally opened. Harold stood there, pale, his expression tight. "Evelyn, the board has reached a preliminary decision." His voice trembled slightly. It was impossible to tell if it was fear or relief. My heart steadied in my chest. I stepped closer. What did they decide? He swallowed hard. Then someone from the table called out, "Bring her in." And just like that, the moment I had been preparing for finally arrived. I walked back into the room with my spine straight and my pulse steady. Though it felt as if I was stepping into a place where the air had changed shape. Every board member watched me, some with guilt, some with apology, some with the raw shock of people who had just realized how close they came to losing everything. At the far end of the table, Preston looked hollow. The color drained from his face. Madison sat rigid, her lips pressed together so tightly they had turned white. Harold gestured toward the seat at the head of the table. I sat, folding my hands in front of me, waiting for a few breaths. No one spoke. It was Patricia who finally broke the silence. "We reviewed every document you provided," she said. Her voice was steady, but her eyes carried the weight of the past hour. "There is no question. Misconduct happened. Serious misconduct." A murmur of agreement echoed softly around the room. Patricia continued, "Effective immediately. The board is suspending both Mr. Pierce and Ms. Carter pending a full independent investigation." A sharp breath left Preston. He looked at Madison, but she stared at the table, her expression frozen. He whispered something to her, something desperate, but she did not respond. Harold added, "The investigation will include all financial transfers, unauthorized approvals, protocol violations, and external communications. If criminal activity is confirmed, this will be turned over to federal authorities." Madison suddenly pushed back from her chair, the legs screeching across the floor. "This is ridiculous. Evelyn set me up. She is trying to claw her way back into power." I stayed still. I did not need to defend myself. The evidence had already spoken. Patricia looked at her calmly. "We have documentation from multiple departments confirming the pattern of misconduct. This is not personal. This is accountability." Madison's jaw trembled. Her eyes darted around the room, looking for support, but found none. For a moment she looked smaller than I had ever seen her. Preston stood next. His voice was barely above a whisper. "Evelyn, I never meant for any of this to happen. I only wanted to position us competitively." "Then why hide it?" I asked quietly. He closed his eyes, and in that moment I knew he was not evil. He was simply weak. Weakness, unchecked, could be just as dangerous. The chairman cleared his throat. "Now, regarding the future of this company," he paused, letting the words settle. "We would like you to return as executive chairwoman in an active capacity, full authority reinstated, full oversight granted. We need you." For a moment, I could not speak. I had expected vindication. I had expected justice. But I had not expected to feel something rise in my chest that felt dangerously close to grief. Not for them. For the years I spent believing I had to let go of what James and I built. I lifted my chin. If I return, it will not be symbolic. I will restructure the oversight model. I will correct the weak points that allowed this to happen. And I will ensure our leadership reflects the integrity HeartTech was built on. The chairman nodded. "That is exactly what we want." Patricia leaned forward. "And what this company desperately needs." I took a slow breath. then you have my answer." A soft exhale of relief spread across the room. Even those who once doubted me seemed to sink into their seats, as if they finally trusted that the ground beneath them had stopped shifting. But there was one more thing I needed to do. I turned to Nancy, who sat quietly at the far end, her hand still trembling slightly. "Nancy, your courage to speak up today protected this company more than you realize. When I return, I want you on my executive review committee." She blinked at me, stunned me. "Yes, you have earned it." Her eyes filled with tears she quickly wiped away. The chairman stood. "Then it is unanimous. Welcome back, Mrs. Hart." The meeting adjourned. Papers shuffled, chairs scraped. Hushed conversations drifted through the room. Board members approached me, one by one, offering apologies, gratitude, embarrassment. I accepted each with a small nod. I did not soften the edges of my words. I did not pretend this had been easy. Respect meant little if it was not rooted in truth. When the room finally emptied, I remained seated, letting the quiet wash over me. The sun outside had shifted west, and beams of afternoon light stretched across the conference table. Dust floated in the glow, moving slowly, gently, as if the whole room had exhaled. I looked toward the door where Madison and Preston had stood earlier. They were gone now. Their voices, their influence, their arrogance had been stripped away in a single morning. Karma was not always poetic or beautiful, but this time it had been swift and precise. After a long moment, I rose and walked to my old office. The room was dark. My hand hesitated before switching on the light. When the lamp glowed, I saw the empty desk. Someone had removed Madison's nameplate already. On the corner of the desk lay a small box with a note taped to the top. "Property found during office cleaning." I opened it and felt a tightness gather in my throat. Inside was the brooch, not the decorative one I wore today, but the one James had given me on our 10th anniversary, the one I thought had been lost years ago. I held it in my palm, the metal warm from the light. For a moment, the years folded in on themselves, and I could almost hear his laugh again, deep and soft, reminding me that what we built mattered because of how we built it. I placed the brooch against my heart and let out a breath that felt like release. I stepped out of the office and looked down the hall where employees moved with purpose again. Conversations felt lighter. The unease that had clouded this place for months had begun to lift. Change was already taking root. As I walked toward the exit, I spotted Emily waiting by the lobby windows with her father. She ran to me the moment she saw my face. "Grandma, did it go okay?" I knelt so we were eye level. "Yes, sweetheart. It went exactly as it needed to." Her father approached slowly. His voice was quiet. "Mom, I heard what happened. I am proud of you." Something inside me softened. "Thank you, Will." He smiled, small but real. I stood and took Emily's hand. For the first time in months, I felt something close to peace. Outside, the sky was opening into a clear late afternoon, golden and warm, the kind of sky that felt like a beginning. Before leaving the building, I turned back once more, letting my eyes linger on the glass facade of Heart Tech. My company, my legacy, my fight, my victory. If you stayed with me through this story, thank you. If you have ever been underestimated, dismissed, or silenced, I hope this reminded you of your own strength. Tell me where you are watching from. Share your thoughts. And subscribe if you want more stories of women who refuse to be pushed aside.